In a matter of seconds, everyday life turns into chaos. Today, we remember 6 urban disasters that shook entire neighborhoods and changed the lives of thousands of people. Stay tuned until the end. Shocking facts and important lessons await you. The collapse of the bridge in Genoa was one of the most painful tragedies in modern Italy, an event that changed the life of the city in an instant and called into question the safety of the country's entire road infrastructure. On August 18, 2018, the span of the famous Morandi Bridge, officially known as the Morandi Viaduct, collapsed in the middle of a hot summer day. At that moment, there were cars, trucks, and a bus on the motorway, and the collapse interrupted their journey, claimed human lives, and left a scar on the city's memory. This bridge, stretching over the river and railway tracks, had long been a symbol of engineering thought and, at the same time, a subject of controversy about the state of the country's bridge system. Residents noted cracks and corrosion, engineers and officials exchanged reports, and the real danger seemed to be somewhere on the periphery of attention. At the moment of the disaster, storm clouds were gathering over Genoa. It was raining, and heavy goods vehicles, lined up in the daily traffic flow, found themselves under the rubble of concrete sections and steel cables. Rescue services responded quickly. Firefighters, military personnel, volunteers, and ordinary residents rushed to pull people out of wrecked cars, provide first aid, and clear the debris. The whole country watched as a dramatic operation unfolded, accompanied by hope and despair, because every minute could save someone's life. The investigation into the causes of the collapse attracted the attention of experts from across Europe and around the world. It revealed years of underfunding, maintenance problems, corrosion of reinforcement bars, and design solutions which, combined with climatic stresses and increasing traffic loads, had created a catastrophic situation. Articles and reports were identified that contained warnings and recommendations, but their impact was insufficient, and this caused a powerful public outcry. People demanded answers, accountability, and justice. The political consequences of the bridge collapse were significant. Government agencies responsible for transport and infrastructure faced accusations of negligence and ineffective control. Lawsuits began, inspections were carried out, and standards for the construction and operation of bridges were revised. At the city and national levels, programs were launched to audit all major transport arteries, strengthen monitoring, and introduce modern technologies for diagnosing the condition of structures. This incident became a catalyst for change. New rules were adopted for regular inspections. Additional funds were allocated for the repair and reinforcement of bridges, and procedures for the reconstruction of the most vulnerable structures were accelerated. In parallel with the official measures, society organized itself. Charitable foundations raised funds to help the victims and families of the deceased. Volunteers participated in restoration work, and local initiatives sought to perpetuate the memory of those who did not return home. The tragedy affected not only economic and technical aspects, but also the spiritual fabric of the city. The residents of Genoa felt a sense of loss of the sophistication of everyday life, a lost sense of security that had previously seemed self-evident. Too often, people do not notice how fragile infrastructure can be until an event occurs that destroys their familiar reality. The years following the disaster resulted in the active introduction of new engineering practices, the use of deformation monitoring sensors, regular non-destructive testing, a review of road load designs, and the reinforcement of structural materials. Particular attention was paid to staff training and the creation of mechanisms for rapid response to alarms. The reconstruction of the bridge and adjacent areas was carried out under public scrutiny. Designers and builders emphasized the importance of transparency and the involvement of independent experts in order to restore the trust of the city's residents. Memorials were created and days of mourning were organized in memory of the victims, where people gathered to remember those who lost their lives, celebrate the heroic actions of the rescuers, and express hope for a better future. The story of the collapse of the bridge in Genoa became a lesson for Italy and many other countries that cutting corners on maintenance and ignoring warnings can lead to immeasurable costs. It served as a reminder of the need for constant monitoring of critical infrastructure and that safety must be a priority, not a formality. Over the years, memories of that August day have not faded, but they have been transformed into measurable changes in policy, engineering practice, and public awareness. People have become more demanding of transparency and accountability, and the authorities have begun to plan long-term investments in infrastructure. The lives of those affected and the memory of those who died have become a motivation for change, and perhaps it is through such a price that the world is learning to appreciate what once seemed eternal and indestructible. This tragedy remains a warning and a call to action. Take care of each other, pay attention to your surroundings, and do not allow cost-cutting or bureaucracy to jeopardize human lives. Only then can the lessons learned from pain and loss be turned into real change so that such tragedies never happen again. The collapse of the Rana Plaza building was one of the most horrific and memorable tragedies of our time, an event that forever changed the perception of the price of cost-cutting and disregard for human life in the pursuit of profit. On April 24, 2013, an 8-story complex on the outskirts of Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, suddenly collapsed, engulfing thousands of people and leaving behind bitterness and a demand for change. The building housed garment factories where women and men worked, many of them laboring 12 or more hours a day to feed their families, provide for their children and pay for housing. Their workplaces were part of a global chain of clothing production for well-known brands, and it was this link between local conditions and global consumption that gave the tragedy an international resonance. On the eve of the collapse, landlords and engineers had discovered cracks in the structure, and people had complained of unusual noises and floor subsidence. But the factory owners insisted on continuing work, threatening dismissal and loss of wages. On that fateful day, many came to work, naively believing that earning a living was more important than their suspicions, and the building collapsed in the middle of the working day. The death toll exceeded 1,130, and more than 2,000 people were injured. Among the victims were children, the elderly, and young mothers, whose names and faces remain forever in the memories of their families and neighbors. The reaction of the local community, international organizations, and consumers was immediate. Volunteers, rescuers, and ordinary residents rushed to the scene of the disaster, pulled people out from under the rubble with their own hands, brought food and water, set up aid camps, and demanded justice. The international media raised the issue of supply chain transparency and the responsibility of Western brands, which often outsource production to low-cost countries without monitoring working conditions and the safety of the buildings where their products are manufactured. Campaigns began around the world to improve working conditions and sign documents guaranteeing factory inspections. Court proceedings and investigations revealed corruption, circumvention of building codes, and cost-cutting on repairs. It turned out that the owners had added extra floors to the building without the proper permits and had not carried out the necessary reinforcement of the foundations, while the inspections referred to by the organizations were formal and inadequate. After the tragedy, international initiatives and agreements were launched to improve safety in textile factories. Human rights organizations and workers' associations began to demand mandatory inspections, compensation for victims, and payments to the families of those who died, while major clothing brands came under public pressure and were forced to review their practices for working with contractors. Aid funds were set up, medical and psychological rehabilitation programs for victims were launched, and projects were initiated to retrain workers and create alternative sources of income for families who had lost their breadwinners. Volunteer groups helped with paperwork, legal advice, and basic needs. Nevertheless, justice was slow in many cases. Payments were fragmented, legal proceedings dragged on for years, and many families never received full compensation, causing anger and disappointment among those who had lost loved ones. The tragedy also prompted the governments of clothing exporting countries and importers themselves to consider reforming the industry. Tighter controls, supply chain transparency, the introduction of modern safety standards, and compulsory insurance became the main points of discussion between business, government, and civil society. Having learned from bitter experience, the international community began to invest in training programs for factory managers, engineers, and inspectors, as well as in the development of local institutions responsible for enforcing building and labor standards. This helped to reduce the risk of similar events recurring, but did not completely eliminate systemic problems in any country. The memory of those who died is perpetuated by memorials and commemorative events in Bangladesh and abroad, and the stories of survivors and victims' families continue to remind us of the human side of global manufacturing. Behind every label on a garment is the life and fate of a specific person. The story of Rana Plaza has become a symbol of how cutting corners on safety, the pursuit of profit, and disregard for workers' rights can lead to large-scale tragedy. It has pushed consumers towards more conscious choices and companies towards measures that previously seemed costly but necessary. Another important legacy is that many workers and activists have gained a voice and space to organize, created trade unions and mutual aid networks, and learned to demand compliance with standards and seek legal change, even if the road to full accountability and recovery remains long and difficult. The collapse of Rana Plaza will forever remain a reminder that behind economic indicators and global trends are real people whose rights and lives cannot be sacrificed for the sake of speeding up production. This tragedy reminds us that safety and human dignity must be the top priorities of any industry, and that silence and indifference can come at too high a price. The global community must learn lessons, constantly monitor standards, maintain transparency, and ensure accountability so that nothing like this ever happens again, and so that the memory of the victims serves as a catalyst for sustainable change and human attention to those who create the things we use every day. Only joint action will protect workers and restore consumer confidence around the world. This is a real and difficult path. The gas explosion in the suburbs of Mexico City in the autumn of 1984 went down in history as one of the most devastating man-made disasters of the 20th century, and as a tragedy in which human negligence, outdated infrastructure, and dense urban development collided. Early in the morning, residents woke up to the sharp smell of gas and a slight dull rumbling in the underground collectors. Many felt the windows shaking and strange vibrations, but no one paid much attention to the first signs of impending disaster. First there were cracks and weak tremors, then the first explosion, followed by a series of detonations that caused houses to collapse, streets to be engulfed in fire, and columns of smoke to rise into the sky, forming black trails visible for many kilometers. People ran out into the streets in panic, wearing nightgowns and dressing gowns, some jumping out of windows to save themselves, others trying to rescue their children and documents. But the shock waves spared neither people nor property. Roofs collapsed, facades crumbled, cars were turned into piles of crumpled metal, and beloved courtyards and shops were reduced to ashes in a matter of minutes. Hundreds of families were left homeless, thousands of people lost their normal way of life, and many suffered severe burns, fractures, and injuries of varying degrees. Rescue services, overwhelmed with calls and distress signals, worked non-stop, bringing in firefighters, medics, volunteers, and military units, but the scale of the destruction required far more resources and professional equipment than was available in the first few hours. The fires burned for days and even weeks, flaring up from time to time in places where damaged tanks and supply lines continued to fuel the blaze. Only after long and painstaking work to plug the leaks and eliminate the sources of fuel was it possible to stop new explosions and stabilize the situation. The investigation revealed a complex set of causes for the disaster: corroded and outdated pipelines, formal and superficial inspections by the responsible services, insufficient monitoring and negligence in operation, as well as the practice of building residential areas in close proximity to industrial facilities and hazardous substance storage sites, which turned ordinary streets into high-risk zones. Cases of residents' complaints and signals from utility workers being ignored were uncovered, and bureaucratic obstacles and corruption schemes prevented timely repairs and modernization of the networks, which together created the conditions for the disaster. In the first hours and days after the explosion, neighborhood and volunteer groups, ordinary people and organizations rushed to help the victims. They dug people out of the rubble by hand, brought food and water, organized temporary shelters and first aid stations, and their selflessness saved many lives, becoming a lesson in solidarity. Medical facilities were faced with an influx of seriously ill patients requiring treatment for burns, emergency care, and long-term rehabilitation, and with a shortage of equipment and medicines, medical staff worked in conditions of scarcity, relying on international aid and support from charitable organizations. The economic consequences were catastrophic. Destroyed businesses deprived people of their livelihoods. Small businesses disappeared along with their premises and goods, and the restoration of infrastructure, including water, electricity, and roads, required significant investment and a long time. Restoration work stretched on for months and years, changing the fate of entire neighborhoods and families. The authorities initiated a review of the requirements for the storage and transport of flammable substances, tightened zoning and urban planning regulations, stepped up inspections and monitoring of communications, and launched programs to inform the public about the rules of conduct in the event of leaks and accidents. However, the implementation of many measures was difficult due to limited budgets, administrative delays, and resistance from interested parties. Public investigations and hearings revealed a host of violations, and public pressure forced companies and officials to take responsibility for what had happened. Lawsuits began, contractors were audited, contracts were revised, and victims and their families demanded fair compensation and measures to prevent new tragedies. The stories of survivors and eyewitness accounts served as a long-lasting reminder to society of the vulnerability of urban life, and that neglecting infrastructure can cost human lives. These stories became the basis for civic initiatives aimed at monitoring industrial facilities and protecting residents' rights. Engineers and researchers conducted a detailed analysis of the causes and developed technical recommendations. Regular inspection of underground networks using modern diagnostic technologies, replacement of outdated pipelines, installation of automated leak detection and emergency shutdown systems, as well as the creation of risk maps and the relocation of hazardous facilities away from residential areas. The consequences of the explosion also affected the insurance and social protection sectors. Requirements for compulsory insurance against industrial accident risks and support programs for families left without breadwinners and livelihoods appeared, but many victims are still fighting for full compensation and justice. The city slowly recovered. Houses were rebuilt, streets were paved and filled with life again. But a deep crack remained in the hearts of many, forever. The Daegu subway fire became one of the most tragic pages in the modern history of South Korea. An event that forever changed the perception of urban risks and showed how quickly a simple lapse in vigilance can turn into mass casualties. On February 18, 2003, in one of the carriages traveling on the city line in the center of Daegu, an arson attack took place. The perpetrator brought a flammable liquid with him and set it alight in the aisle between the seats. The fire, fueled by sparks and flying debris, spread instantly, sending up columns of black smoke that poisoned the air and made it impossible for people to breathe. People on the trains and platforms did not initially realize the scale of the disaster, but soon the tunnel was filled with acrid smoke. Visibility dropped to zero, and panic swept through the crowd. Passengers tried to escape through doors and narrow passages, many stumbling and falling, creating dense traffic jams in which it was impossible to keep moving. People lost consciousness from suffocation and burns, and those who managed to get to the surface described horrific scenes of fire and black waves of smoke billowing from the subway entrances. Rescue services arrived quickly, but the specific nature of the underground space, the narrowness of the tunnels, and the high temperature made access to the scene of the fire difficult. And the lack of coordinated evacuation procedures and shortcomings in staff training meant that help did not arrive as quickly as the circumstances required. Systemic failures were revealed. The materials used to finish the carriages and platforms were too flammable, the evacuation plan was insufficiently thought out, and the warning system malfunctioned. Many passengers did not receive clear instructions and acted on their own initiative, which, in conditions of smoke, turned into a tragedy. The consequences of the fire were catastrophic. 192 people died. Many suffered severe burns and long-term effects from smoke inhalation, and hundreds of families lost loved ones or suffered deep psychological trauma. The public reaction was one of pain and anger. Residents demanded clear explanations, punishment for those responsible, and fundamental changes in the urban transport safety system. The government and metro management came under intense public pressure and large-scale inspections. Regulatory reviews, dismissals, and criminal cases against those responsible began. New fire safety standards were introduced. Flammable materials were replaced with non-combustible ones, ventilation and smoke removal systems were improved, automatic fire detectors and fire extinguishing equipment were installed, and staff were retrained in fire and evacuation procedures. Station locations and evacuation routes were also reviewed, and standards for technical maintenance and regular training of rescue teams were strengthened. There was a surge of activity at the civil society level. Groups were formed to help victims and their families, volunteers became actively involved in the recovery and support of victims, and human rights organizations demanded transparency and the participation of independent experts in inspections. The stories of survivors and accounts of small acts of heroism by random passers-by and metro employees who risked their lives to save others have long remained in the public consciousness and have become a symbol of both human bravery and systemic failures. The tragedy caused an international outcry. Experts from different countries participated in analyzing the causes and developing recommendations, and Daegu's experience was taken into account in the design and modernization of underground transport systems in other megacities. However, as is often the case, the lessons were learned at the cost of human lives, and many still debate what could have been done differently to avoid such a disaster. One of the important outcomes was the strengthening of public oversight. Residents began to demand access to information about risks, monitoring and response plans, and local associations gained more opportunities to influence safety decisions. Culturally and psychologically, the fire left a deep mark. Commemorative events and memorials immortalized the memory of those who died, and support programs helped survivors and families cope with the heavy burden of loss. Medical research conducted after the events expanded knowledge about the treatment of burns and poisoning from combustion products, which helped improve assistance in similar incidents in the future. The economic impact was also significant. Rebuilding infrastructure, repairing rolling stock, and restoring passenger confidence required considerable resources, and the restoration of some sections was carried out under the close scrutiny of the public and experts. The Taegu tragedy remains a reminder that urban safety requires constant attention, adequate funding, and open communication between authorities, transport operators, and residents. Only through joint efforts can risks be reduced and similar disasters prevented, saving lives and public trust. In addition, relatives of the victims and survivors demanded justice and compensation, and public pressure forced the system to resume investigations, tighten the accountability of officials, and strengthen oversight of transport operators. The authorities recognized the need for systematic support for those affected. Programs for psychotherapy and social rehabilitation, highly specialized assistance centers, and initiatives to restore jobs for those who had lost their livelihoods were introduced. In the education sector, modules on responding to emergencies in schools and universities were added, and emergency services began to conduct joint exercises more frequently, simulating situations with limited access and high levels of smoke. Technical innovations have also been applied. New materials, smoke flow monitoring systems, and automatic power cutoff in damaged areas have been introduced. These measures will not bring back those who have been lost, but they have served as an attempt to learn lessons and reduce the risk of similar disasters recurring, making urban infrastructure more resilient and the population better prepared for emergencies. The collapse of a residential complex in the coastal area of Surfside was one of the most shocking events of the early 2020s and triggered an unprecedented wave of investigations, expert analyses, and public discussion of the factors that led to the tragedy. The focus was not only on the debris and engineering conclusions, but also on the human destinies, lost homes, and families who had to rebuild their lives. On the day of the collapse, rescuers, volunteers, and emergency services worked in unbearable conditions, pulling personal belongings and records from the rubble, trying to find answers to the question of how a residential tower block, built and operated relatively recently, could have collapsed. The search for causes turned into a complex mosaic of technical data, maintenance records, and residents' testimonies. The building's history prior to the disaster included reports of structural problems, complaints about leaks and repairs in underground car parks, reports of subsidence and corrosion of concrete elements, and all these fragments became the subject of close scrutiny. Attention was paid to the quality of the raw materials, design assumptions, and structural changes that could have affected the load-bearing capacity. A professional debate unfolded around the causes. Some experts emphasized the role of prolonged exposure to moisture and the aggressive marine climate on reinforced concrete, which over time leads to corrosion of the reinforcement and cracking of the coating. Others pointed to possible errors in the initial design and load calculations, while others suggested that inadequate and poor quality maintenance and management of common property was to blame. Human and institutional factors played a significant role. The practice of postponing costly repairs, bureaucratic delays in approving reinforcement projects, and sometimes formal inspections that did not always reflect the actual condition of complex structures. At the same time, investigators and independent experts analyzed documents on renovations and modernizations, checked records of permits, looked for signs of changes that could have increased the vulnerability of the structure, and compared the actual condition with the regulatory requirements in force at the time of design and operation. The result was a complex picture in which technical, financial, and managerial aspects were intertwined into a single problem. The public reaction was sharp and emotional. Residents demanded transparency, the families of the victims demanded accountability and compensation, and the media engaged in heated discussions about how the law, architecture, and the housing market could and should protect people. In the wake of the outrage, lawsuits and administrative proceedings began, during which attempts were made to establish the degree of guilt of various participants, from designers and contractors to management companies and supervisory authorities. In parallel with the legal battles, the professional community was reforming its standards. Engineers began to demand more regular and thorough inspections of load-bearing structures, the introduction of modern methods of non-destructive testing, deformation monitoring, and prolonged control of underground building elements, as well as stricter consideration of climatic influences when designing buildings near the sea. At the local community level, initiatives emerged to take risks into account and inform residents, improve common property management practices, and involve independent experts in decisions on major repairs and modernization. These measures are aimed at ensuring that residents' voices are an important part of the decision-making process on housing safety. An important part of the aftermath has been the issue of remembrance. The establishment of memorials, the creation of funds to help families affected by the tragedy, and programs to support psychological rehabilitation and legal assistance for those who have lost loved ones or their homes. Although technical reports and studies have provided a wealth of data, the final conclusions about the combination of causes are still being debated in scientific and public circles. And this debate itself has become an important element of the public dialogue on the safety of the urban environment. The disaster served as a reminder of the fragility of everyday infrastructure, and that long-term maintenance and transparency of decisions are of paramount importance to people's lives. The lessons learned from this tragedy have prompted a review of approaches and tighter controls in the construction industry, because only a combination of engineering responsibility, effective management, and public vigilance can reduce the risk of such disasters recurring. The public demanded answers and accountability. The families of the victims took their cases to the courts and public hearings, and local authorities undertook to review the design and operation standards for coastal buildings, taking into account the corrosive effects of the marine climate and the need for regular monitoring of structures. Memorials and commemorative events helped to preserve the human face of the tragedy, while the professional community shifted its focus to improving standards and training specialists. This is a long-term endeavor. The disaster at the coal mine in Donbass was a difficult and pivotal moment in the region's history, an event that exposed systemic problems in the industry and brought irreparable loss to hundreds of families. In 2007, in a mine where miners worked in conditions that were a harsh reality for many, a methane explosion occurred, the shock wave of which tore down the supports, damaged the ventilation shafts, and left entire shifts of people under a pile of rock. Calls and letters about the smell of gas and cracks in the supports often went unheeded because economic priorities and production schedules took precedence over safety precautions. This imbalance between production demands and safety standards ultimately resulted in tragedy. The first alarm bells rang on the surface when families began to notice the delay in the return of their loved ones, and people gathered in the mine yard with flashlights and anxiety in their eyes. Rescue teams were dispatched immediately, but the underground conditions, high concentrations of toxic gases, and the risk of further collapses made the operations extremely dangerous and difficult. Miners and rescuers worked with limited equipment, sometimes relying on old breathing apparatus and their own experience, risking their lives to reach those who were still showing signs of life. Volunteers and relatives joined forces, bringing warm clothes, food, and moral support, while local medics set up first aid stations for the injured and those suffering from trauma and shock. The community of thousands, accustomed to hard work and mutual support, mobilized quickly, but the severity of the losses and the urgency of humanitarian needs required a systematic response and outside assistance. The information field was tense. News about the number of victims and fatalities spread through newspapers and television, was discussed at rallies at the mine gates and in the city council, and people demanded answers from management and government officials. The investigation into the causes revealed a combination of factors: outdated equipment, inadequate ventilation, violations of technological procedures, and formal, sometimes fictitious safety checks. Corruption schemes, in which savings were made on repairs and replacement of parts, also surfaced in the investigation materials and caused public outcry. The authorities were faced with a difficult task: to provide compensation to the victims, punish those responsible, and, at the same time, carry out reforms that would increase the reliability of the mining industry. Changes to the regulatory framework were initiated. Control over ventilation systems and monitoring of methane content in mine workings was tightened. Stricter requirements for rescue service equipment and regular staff training were introduced, and programs to replace outdated mechanisms and modernize safety systems were launched. The disaster left a deep mark on the public consciousness. It became a symbol of the price paid by people in areas with developed extractive industries. Families lost their breadwinners, children were left without parents, and towns and villages faced a long period of recovery and psychological rehabilitation. Human rights organizations and trade unions became more active, demanding transparency in the decision-making chain and compensation payments, while international experts participated in risk assessments and the preparation of recommendations to reduce hazards in mines. Initiatives were launched to improve housing conditions for the families of the victims, organize professional retraining programs, and create trusts for long-term support for those affected. Cultural responses also played a significant role. Commemorative events, monuments, and days of mourning helped to preserve the memory of those lost and give form to grief in the public sphere. An important lesson was the realization that technical solutions and economic plans should not take precedence over human life and safety. After the disaster, society began to demand a balance between extraction and human life, between profit and risk management. Although formal changes were adopted, the path to full implementation of the reforms proved to be long. It required investment, political will, and oversight by independent bodies. Miners, their families, and industry veterans organized movements for safe working conditions, for the right to quality equipment, and for a system in which workers' complaints are taken seriously rather than as an obstacle to production. The economic consequences of the disaster affected the entire regional economy. The closure of some mines, delays in coal deliveries, and reduced revenues for local businesses forced the authorities to seek ways to diversify economic activity and support social stability. In the scientific and engineering community, the event became the subject of analysis. Scientists and engineers developed more sophisticated monitoring techniques, proposed integrated early warning systems and recommendations for the design of ventilation networks and supports that better withstand sudden explosions and prevent the spread of shock waves. Psychological work with victims and witnesses became part of long-term recovery programs. Counseling, support groups, and educational projects helped people cope with trauma and return to a meaningful and productive life. The disaster at the coal mine in Donbass is remembered as a tragedy that exposed the vulnerability of those who risk their lives every day for the sake of energy and industry, and as a signal that responsibility for safety should lie not only with workers, but also with companies, authorities, and society as a whole. Only joint efforts based on transparency, technical standards, and respect for human life can reduce risk and preserve the lives of future generations. The memory of those who died inspires action and will never be forgotten.